Hello and welcome to the Korea Society and to today's program, a discussion with Dr. Peter Banseok Kwon on his newly released book, Cornerstone of the Nation, The Defense Industry and the Building of a Modern Korea under Park Chung Hee. Thank you all for joining on this beautiful day in New York City, beautiful early summer day. My name is Tom Byrne, and I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society. Today's conversation will delve into the creation of South Korea's defense industry, and as the title says, the building of a modern South Korea under Park Chung Hee. In his new book, Professor Kwon provides a fresh lens through which to understand Korea's national development by focusing on how Park Chung Hee fashioned a Jaebol-led military modernization within the framework of his heavy and chemical industrialization policy. The distinct character of economic modernization developed under Park Chung Hee successfully set a path transforming South Korea from a low-income to a high-income country, an achievement which only a few countries have managed. Analyzing newly classified primary source documents from the Korean government, Professor Kwon sheds light on the crucial role that defense industrialization played in Korea's miraculous or seemingly miraculous economic development, the effects of which we continue to see as shaping the country today. Professor Kwon has produced a comprehensive and engaging work that critically examines the relationship between government, the military, business, and the citizenry. Ultimately, Park Chung Hee legacy is that he is one of the great nation builders, in my opinion, in history, on par with Kemal Ataturk of Turkey, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, and Deng Xiaoping of China. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Dr. Peter Kwon is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Albany, SUNY. He previously held the Sun Young Kim postdoctoral fellowship in Korean Studies at Harvard University, where he also earned his PhD in history and East Asian languages, and his master's in regional studies, East Asia. His research interests include the history of the Korean defense industry, military-civilian relations, and the dynamics between authoritarian politics and civil society in East Asia. As a Fulbright scholar, Peter will be serving as a visiting professor at Korea National Defense University in South Korea for the academic year 2024-2025. Before we delve into tonight's discussion, I would like to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors, the names of which are prominently displayed in the lobby, for making this program possible. The Korea Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on members to produce timely, informative, and insightful programs that highlight the importance of the U.S.-ROK relationship, and particularly the importance of the people-to-people aspect of that relationship. So please head over to the Korea Society's website for more information and consider being a member today. For tonight's program, we are welcoming your questions live. We will provide an opportunity for in-person attendees to ask questions directly. For our virtual audience, please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. And with that, let's get started. Okay.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
It's great to get you down here from Albany. Great. So I'll start with a warm-up beginning question. Peter, what were your motivations and inspirations for tackling this book? How long was your journey in writing the book? And among the many acknowledgments you make in your book, who were the most influential? And one last aspect, how critical was your discovery of recently declassified documents in shaping the narrative of the book?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I must start by explaining my personal journey, how I got interested in the topic. Has a lot to do also with my personal background, actually. When I was a child, my father was a graduate of a Korean military academy, so I grew up in a military base. So of course, I was immersed into this fascinating Korean militarized culture from early on. I think that's when I first developed the interest in military. And I actually used to work in one of the larger Korean companies that was also a defense producer for several years as a research associate. So that got me really interested in the Korean defense industry. However, I would say the most one of the most profound influences was my advisor when I was doing my PhD, Carter Ecker, who was actually a historian of a Park Chung Hee era, and specifically of Park Chung Hee's the militarism, how that shaped his post-war development of South Korea. So that also very much intrigued me to engage in this topic. But lastly, actually, coincidentally, when I was doing my field research in South Korea in 2012, I was actually working on a completely different subject. Then I accidentally ran into these fascinating, very recently declassified military records on the so-called the Yugo Operation. So those of you who are not familiar with the Yugo Operation, it was a classified, top secret military program that also involved nuclear arms development. At the time, there was no literature on this topic. So I got very fascinated, immediately contacted my PhD dissertation advisor, Professor Ecker, told him I want to switch the topic. So actually, that's how the journey began in 2012. And then I completed the book in 2024. I finished my doctoral dissertation in 2016. So it was a very long journey. These declassified documents were very critical to, of course, to write about this topic before the rise of a democracy in South Korea. Actually, before the early 2000s, there were no records on the Korean defense industry. So I found these records in the so-called the presidential archives. At the time, it was located in the city of Seongnam. And then every year they'll release, declassify more documents every year. So this is how I accumulated the critical documents on Korean defense industry. And then I visited the research institutes, various places, the defense corporations, the corporate archives, then conducted various oral interviews with those people who were involved in the defense production, the engineers, the technicians, the scientists. And this is how I was able to write this book. It took me about 12 years, I believe.
Well, it's a well-spent 12 years. I enjoyed reading this book tremendously. So Cornerstone of the Nation focuses on Park Chung Hee's pivotal role in Korea's economic modernization. Can you tell us something about this inspiration you had to broaden Park's phrase, defense being the cornerstone of the nation, 국방의 초석, to something much grander, Park's policies and leadership being cornerstone of the nation, 국방의 초석. So how did you make that jump?
Yeah, so Park Chung-hee used the phrase, the cornerstone of national defense, to describe the Agency for Defense Development, which he created as the research institute for the weapons manufacturing or the domestic weapons manufacturing. However, in the process of my research journey, I realized the very comprehensive, broad role of the defense industry in South Korea's economic, technological, as well as industrial transformation. And this is why, instead of using the cornerstone of a national defense, I realized the defense industry actually can be framed as the cornerstone of the nation. And actually, my name, coincidentally, also means a cornerstone, Peter Banseok Kwon. So everything sort of aligned together. It's, I think, interesting.
Great, okay. So maybe we can talk about the historical context. So Park Chung Hee came to power in 1961, if I have the year right. But the military industrialization policies really reached fruition and started to develop fully in the 1970s, right? What was the historical context that really prompted this, both domestically, North Korean actions against South Korea, international, what was going on in the broader international context, and then also could you talk about the Nixon doctrine?
Absolutely. So 1968, North Korea started to escalate there are various provocations coming from North Korea, starting with the 1968, the infamous the Blue House raid, when North Koreans sent 31 commandos to actually assassinate Park Chung Hee. And then U.S. show very lackluster, I would say, sport to defend South Korea at the time because it was also involved in the Vietnam War. And Park Chung-hee's response was to develop Korea's a more independent weapon capability as well as a defense capability. So he started to build. He created the so-called the Homeland Reserve Forces, using the 2.5 million civilians to expand South Korea's defense forces. And then in 1969, there was the announcement, of course, the Nixon Doctrine in Guam, where President Nixon announced the planned withdrawal of all the troops from its Asian allied nations, including in South Korea. This came as a shock to not just the Park Chung-hee, but entire South Korean people. You can see at the time, a lot of politicians, even the opposition parties, were talking about the threat that would come from the withdrawal of U.S. troops. So it created the sense of a national security crisis. I mean, you have escalating threats coming from North Korea. Simultaneously, the U.S. planned to withdraw the troops. And this context, however, gave a very good justification for Park Chung Hee to mobilize the entire nation, the industries and the resources for this a single mission to develop a more independent defense industry. So that really set the context for Park Chung-hee's defense industry project.
Right. Wasn't the Nixon, I mean, I'm not a student of the Nixon Doctrine, but what I recall reading from your book, the original doctrine was Nixon had, the U.S. had something like 64,000 troops in Korea at the time, and he withdrew, he said he would withdraw 20,000, so he did. But then later on, when Vice President Agnew visited Korea, there was this shock that, so I guess his visit was around 1971 to South Korea, that Nixon would pull out all troops in 5 years' time. So in 1976, there'd be 0 U.S. ground forces in Korea. I mean, that...
Yes. So
more than Jimmy Carter's troop withdrawal plan in 1976, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this gives South Korea basically 5 years to prepare an army and the military capability to withstand any invasion from North Korea. So South Korea had to very rapidly develop its own defense industry. I have to also explain, in the early 1970s, South Korea could not even develop its own arms, the guns or ammunitions, whereas in North Korea, they could produce their own AK-47, all the conventional infantry arms, thanks to the massive Soviet military aid that began in the 1950s all the way to 1960s. So North Korea had a capability to build its own arms to be used in the weapons, I mean, as in the war. In South Korea, complete contrast they're in a situation where they had to completely depend on the United States for the imported arms. So this also increased Park Chung-hee's sense of urgency to build the defense industry.
Mm. Okay. I think a special feature, or maybe a distinguishing feature of Park's Korea-style militarized industrialization, it was a whole-of-the-nation approach. Could you explain what that meant in a Korean context? How did Park Chung-hee mobilize the Jaebol and the citizens to support his policy? And was there strong opposition?
Yes. So the term that Park Chung-hee used to create this whole nation approach was a total security system, 총력 안보 system, 총력 안보 체제. It's basically creating a total wartime state to mobilize the entire nation and the industries and the workforce to create for this expedited, accelerated development of a domestic defense industry. So in order to create this, he solicited, also mobilized the chaebol. The chaebol are the large, what we know as, the Samsung, LG, Hyundai, Kia, the large family-owned conglomerate companies. At the time, they were more actually known as the big companies, but they were not conglomerates with all these diversified products. But Park Chung-hee mobilized them. You can say that even conscripted them actually to join his industrial defense industrialization. And he actually created a very special law in 1973. It was called the Special Law on the Defense Procurement. Basically, this incentivized the chaebol corporations to join in as a defense producer, and also actually penalize them if they did not join. So there's a coercion and also incentives as well. But if they join, they will be a beneficiary of tax cuts, the low interest loans, and also various the foreign technologies, and the state assisted them to be nurtured, to grow very quickly as a very capable and versatile defense producers. And by joining the defense industry, they also join, of course, the signature Park Chung Hee economic policy, the heavy and chemical industrialization, 중화공업 정책, which actually was a dual-purpose industry. I mean, these were the steel, non-ferrous metals, shipbuilding, the heavy machinery, the petrochemical, and the electronics. So 6 pillar industries that could produce both the weapons and the commercial production. So this is how Park Chung-hee was able to mobilize the chaebol and the national resources to pursue the simultaneous development of industrialization and the defense industry.
Right. So the Jaebol were both coerced, but then they were also incentivized, and they would act proactively, I understand. There was one other, in addition to the military procurement law, there was something called in 1972, the August 3rd measure. Can you describe what that is?
Yes, so many Korean companies who joined in Park Chung-hee's first and second 5-year economic development plan started to accumulate a lot of debt. So they're in trouble. And the state basically gave them a lot of loans and to help them, to salvage them from these economic debt. And one of the conditions was to actually join the heavy and chemical industrialization program in 1973. So otherwise, the government would not save them from the debt that they were in. So this is one of the ways how the state recruited these chaebol corporations to join the HCI / the defense industry program.
So at the time, the big family-owned businesses were really big businesses. What I understand from what little I know about Korean economic history is that the term Jaebol, of course, it comes from Japanese, but it was used in Korea in the 1960s. But yet, it was the August 3rd measure, or the August 3rd measure, right? And then also the military procurement law that both compelled and incentivized companies to diversify.
Yes.
Because before 72, like the big diversified corporations like Samsung wasn't well diversified, and all the others became LG now, what we see LG now. But these laws really transformed the Jaebol into what we see today. They always were family-owned, big businesses, but now they became horizontally diversified big businesses, right?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the contributions of joining the defense industry was that defense technology requires the state of art, the technology. So like the precision manufacturing, for example, in order to manufacture the individual weapon parts, at the time you need a 100 millimeter precision of carving the steel. And you require the workers, the skilled workers, the technician, the craftsmen, the scientists and engineers who could develop these crucial components. So all these skills and the technologies that the Korean defense companies and the engineers had to accumulate for the defense industry, eventually they spun off to the commercial production, the commercial manufacturing, and this diversified the skill set. And also through the joint venture with the foreign companies who specialize in the defense technologies, this is how also South Korea promoted its own domestic technological capabilities, and also the research and development, the R&D, and also the testing and evaluation, the T&E skills, and so forth.
So as you note in your book, your book was published this year in 2024, which is the 50th anniversary of the Yugo Operation, if that's what you can call it. So you already talked a little about the Yugo operation, but could you tell us more about it?
Yes. So actually, this is also the topic of my upcoming book, the second book project. So the Yugo operation. I discussed actually also extensively, especially the from 1974 to 1979. This was the most clandestine, the most top secret, the weapon project initiated by Park Chung Hee. At the time, it was so secretive that there were not much documented records. Everything, all the orders were mostly passed down orally from the Park Chung-hee to the policymakers and to the military. And one of the reasons why it was so secretive was because it actually involved the nuclear missile program that was banned by the United States. So South Korea was pursuing the nuclear arms technology and the missile technology secretly under the surveillance of the United States and the CIA. And this is why also not much literature about the Yugo operation. So it was pursued from 1974 until Park Chung-hee's death in 1979.
I get some of these programs must have been very costly, very expensive. So how was Yugo financed? Um, you wrote that its projects bypassed the government's normal budget authorization process, which included review by the Economic Planning Board, which was a very powerful agency in Korea. I knew that from my Peace Corps experience there. And also, it avoided deliberation by the National Assembly, which still functioned even though Park Chung-hee was an authoritarian ruler. So, how was it financed? In particular, could you tell us something about the national defense tax, how big that was? And also something that I think is very fascinating, this National Development Donation Program.
Yes. So the way the Yugo operation operated was very distinct, very different from other national projects under the Park Chung-hee, because Yugo operation was managed directly by the Blue House. So those of you who are not familiar with the Blue House, is the South Korean equivalent of a White House. That's where President Park resided, also implemented his policies. He created a very special office within the Blue House called the Second Economic Secretariat, and there was a man named Oh Won-chul who was at the helm. He was a technocrat with an engineering background. He was a chemical engineer. So using Oh Won-chul as an intermediary, Park Chung-hee directly actually managed and guided the Yugo operation. So it's a very distinct. It was not completely managed by the Ministry of National Defense. It was actually under the jurisdiction of the Blue House, because also it involved the nuclear missile development that was pursued by President Park Chung Hee. And so how was it financed? I mean, it's a very good question, and I cover this extensively also in my book. He began by collecting so-called national defense donation, 방위성금, starting from the 1968 when the North Korea was causing a lot of crisis in the peninsula and causing provocations. This is how he mobilized and inspired Korean people to contribute money, individual money, to South Korea's self-reliant national defense, 자주국방, which became a very powerful slogan throughout late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. But then in 1975, he creates the so-called the national defense tax. So this formalized, made the civilian contribution, the financial contribution compulsory to pay to the government for the defense strengthening. So all their money from the national defense donation and the national defense tax were channeled towards the Yugo operation projects. But of course, the people didn't know nothing about Yugo. They just knew that they were contributing to 자주국방, which means the self-reliant national defense, to strengthen the defense system. But they had no idea, no one has heard of actually the Yugo. That was actually a code word used by the Park Chung-hee's policymakers at the time. It was managed by the so-called the 5-member committee at the military level, Ministry of National Defense, but also the Blue House 5-member committee. So it was a very top secret operation that no one actually knew about. It was not actually until 1993 that the Yugo was known publicly because of the financial scandals that broke out long after Park Chung-hee's death. So until 1993, actually, no one publicly heard or knew about the Yugo Operation.
That's when the National Assembly found out about it, right?
Yes.
1993. That's pretty amazing. It was a well-kept secret. When do you think the U.S. government found out about it?
So the U.S. government had its ears everywhere. There were CIA agents following the. They knew about the nuclear arms program. They found out actually, pretty early on. However, they could not completely keep it under check. But according to the interviews of the policymakers and also the scientists of a so-called the Agency for Defense Development, which actually was a research institute that was pursuing the missile the development. When I interview these folks from the 1970s and their experiences, is that U.S. always keeping a close eye and asking them questions about, and they could not even pursue the missile development at the ADD, the Agency for Development Defense Development headquarters, because the U.S. also had a military officers, working within this agency. So that's how tight the regulations were. So it's amazing that how South Korea was able to actually successfully develop its own indigenous precision missile by 1978, despite the various surveillance everywhere. Um, and Did I answer your question actually?
I wanted to, then we'll get on to the missile. The missile
Yeah.
is the polar bear, right?
Yes.
Okay, we'll get on to that, but in a minute. But can we go a little more about this national development donation?
Mm.
So that's the English. I guess the Korean would be pretty close to that. But national development, you would think that this is just economic development, but it's really, in Park Chung Hee's mind, you really couldn't separate military development from economic development, right? Um, one of the anecdotes in your book, I think is fascinating. It was so in I think put it down here. Yeah. So in 1971, okay, Park invited 350 students from across the nation to attend a ceremony that marked the completion of two 70-ton speedboats funded with donations, the national development donations, from elementary school students.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And Park, in fact, called these new vessels the PK speedboats. So Park called the new vessels PK student ships. So this is pretty amazing that elementary school students are contributing to the building of military vessels. I also think it's fascinating because, having worked on Korea at the time of the IMF crisis, one of the things that really puzzled a lot of the economists who were working on it, people in finance, and of course the IMF was the gold collection campaign. So this was like another form of national donations where Koreans rise to national emergency and voluntarily donate.
Yeah.
And the campaign raised over $2 billion equivalent in gold. Citizens would donate their gold. I think a lot of this is voluntary. Maybe there was some peer pressure as well. Donate gold, and they would get Korean won in exchange. But the Koreans would get gold as equivalent to hard currency, to foreign exchange. So at that time, the sense of national solidarity was really strong because the IMF had designed its austerity measures, the conditions for receiving IMF funding, on the premise that, like Latin America, there'd be capital flight from Korea. But it was just the opposite. There was actually a domestic inflight into the Bank of Korea's coffers from citizens. But now I understand that because the origin is, I think, during the Japanese colonial period, maybe earlier, and also during Park Chung Hee's era, before the IMF crisis.
Yes, I think we really have to also look at the long-term, the historical background of the Korean people, going back to the colonial period, as you mentioned, the Asia-Pacific War, 1930s. The Japanese Empire tried to mobilize the colonies. Korea was one of the colonies at the time. They were mobilized to contribute to Japan's wartime efforts. So Koreans have this collective memory of being mobilized. And then there's a Korean War, when the government also, from both sides, they mobilized the citizens to contribute to the war efforts. And then there was the Vietnam War, when the South Korean troops participated in the Vietnam, and the citizens again mobilized to contribute financially as well. So these previous experience of South Korean people, of course, set, I think, a very powerful foundation for Park Chung Hee to really tap into to maximize their national sport for also for the defense industry.
Right. Okay, so now we can get to the polar bear missile program. Um, so you said it was developed secretly, and I guess financed off budget, right, through these secret measures. So could you tell us a little more about that? Because I mean, South Korea's ability in the 1970s to develop this polar bear missile, right, kind of caught everyone by surprise, right? The U.S. government, maybe the CIA, didn't get wind of this, and how was this kept under wrap? I mean, a missile is not something small; it's something fairly big.
Yes. So in 1971, South Korea initiated so-called the lightning operation, 번개 사업. It was very successful. So in December 1971, Park Chung Hee orders his, the chief in charge of the defense industry, the Chair. I'll probably maybe talk a little more about him a little bit later. This is a technocrat in charge of the defense industry development. Park Chung Hee orders him to develop a precision missile for the first time. So from then on, the Agency for Defense Development, for the convenience, I'll just call them ADD. So this is the research institute in charge of also the weapons manufacturing. It develops, started to brainstorm, to plan this long-term development of South Korea's first indigenous precision missile. And we have to understand, this is a monumental test. There were only 6 nations in the world at the time who had the capability to develop a precision missile. So South Korea had to kind of start from the scratch because the US would not give them the technology, especially the propellant technology or the missile engine, the radar system that was crucial to develop a precision missile. So how did South Korean scientists start this from the scratch? They could not even actually use their headquarters as a testing facility because the U.S., the 8th Army, had officers there. They had an office within the ADD. So at the start, the government actually put the best and the brightest of the Korean engineers and the scientists, a lot of them, aerospace, mechanical, the engineers, and put them in a so-called a safe house. It was an apartment complex. And asked them to develop, to come out with the blueprint or the plan to develop a precision missile. So this started from complete secrecy. And then from then on, from 1972 and forward, the U.S., of course, knew kind of that South Korea was very interested in developing the nuclear missile. But this also, nonetheless, it continued. And those technologies that the U.S. would not grant, South Korea actually very innovatively accumulated from elsewhere, especially from France. And whenever they had an opportunity to send expedition to United States, to any U.S. Defense corporations, they would try to gather any and all technologies related to missile that they could. So this is how they were able to put together all the technologies they accumulated and finally to develop this so-called the polar bear missile, the Baekom, 1978, and caught U.S. by surprise because even though U.S. did give, in the end, gave some propellant technology to South Korea, they never realized that South Korea could actually put together a full-fledged precision missile by 1978. So it actually brought a huge shift in the U.S. Arms policy towards the South Korea, because U.S. finally recognizes that, you know what, if we do not give South Koreans the technology they need, they're gonna do it anyways. Whatever it takes, they'll find a way. Mm-hmm. And this actually caused some huge shift in the Carter administration, which was at start, Carter was very adamant about not giving South Korea the advanced weapon technology. But after the polar bear, the successful launch of the polar bear in 1978, Carter finally realizes that it's hard to stop South Koreans from pursuing what they want. So so this is when Carter starts to kind of lift the ban on many of the weapon technologies, including the F-16, and started to give more aid to South Korea. And this pattern actually continues, even going before Carter. Whenever South Korea achieves something on its own, the U.S. relents and gives them more. And Park Chung Hee was very quick to realize this, and this is one of the reasons why he was so aggressive in pursuing these independent weapon technologies.
Mhm. How was the missile on the polar bear missile unveiled? Did South Korean Army have it in a parade, and all of a sudden the Americans see that there's this missile, or was it tested somewhere?
It was a test launched in September 1978.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and then in the military parade for the army, the national holiday, they would sometimes put in the national parade to also to show Korean people
Right.
that this came out from your national donations and the defense tax. This is a symbol of the 자주국방, where it's the self-reliant national defense.
Right. And so did the polar bear missile program also convince Jimmy Carter not to go ahead with his intention when he was elected president to virtually withdraw all American troops, maybe keep a small number, maybe I think 7,000 in country in a support role, or was that decision made before the polar bear missile program was discovered?
Yeah. So at the time, the Republicans were very opposed to the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea. So Polar Bear's success actually gave justification, reinforced the Republican argument that U.S. should not withdraw troops. And the question was, if the U.S. ends up withdrawing the troops, then Park Chung Hee would definitely go nuclear. And now they have a missile capability. So once it becomes, and that will cause arms race. Japan would want a nuclear missile, and potentially the other nations. So it really solidified, really promoted the Republican argument that, and also the U.S. Army's argument at the time, the U.S. should not fully withdraw troops from South Korea. And this is why Carter, in the end, reverses the withdrawal policy.
Right. That's, I think, just totally fascinating. It's also relevant to concerns we have today. Should we let South Korea develop its own indigenous nuclear force? And also, I think after reading this, South Korea could keep this program secret in the 1970s, even though there were a lot of American soldiers there. The CIA was all over, right? The American Central Intelligence Agency. Not too long ago, it was unveiled that the CIA was bugging the Blue House too. They were successful on bugging the Blue House. So the CIA was all over. Another lesson that I draw from this: we shouldn't have been surprised when North Korea developed its ICBMs and nuclear bomb and all this. When a country, particularly a country of Koreans, is determined to do something, they'll find a way to do it, right? So that's a corollary to how I think about that. You mentioned that technocrats were very key in implementing Park's vision, right, for self-reliant national defense, strong national economy, strong national defense. Can you tell us a little bit more about Oh-won Chol? And he seems to be the most prominent technocrat in your book.
Yes. So Oh-won Chol was what we call the one of the signature, the technocrats that led the South Korea's technocratic governance, and also in really guiding South Korea's the rapid economic transformation, the industrial transformation. He is known as the architect of the HCI, the heavy and chemical industrialization, also the architect of course, the defense industry. So I do highlight his role because he played a very important role in navigating and really to nurture, to develop the blueprint, the roadmap to develop the defense industry under the so-called the HCI framework. However, there were other technocrats too. One of the actually technocrats that I really tried to highlight was somebody who worked under Oh-won Chol. His name is Kim Kwang-mo, Mr. Kim Kwang-mo. He was a sort of a right-hand man of Woncher. But based on my interview with him, I mean, his contributions was also tremendous. He actually, before the so-called the HCI plan, he actually studied Japan very extensively. The Japan actually carried out its
Mhm.
own version of a heavy and chemical industrialization from 1950s and 60s, and the concepts that he borrowed from Japan. And he's actually the one who wrote the master plan. There's a master plan for the heavy and chemical industrialization. He hand wrote it, and then this plan really borrow a lot of details from the Japanese HCI plan, and there are other technocrats like Cheong-seo and many others that I tried to really detail in my book manuscript. But Owencher's role was extremely critical because when he came to the head became the head of the second economic secretariat, he's the one who proposed the HCI plan to Park Chung Hee. He said, "This is how South Korea, in a very short time frame, will develop the defense industry and the commercial base that could support it." So that's why his role was very critical.
Mhm. Right. Um, the taking still staying in the early 1970s, um, the Yushin Constitution was promulgated by Park Chung Hee in 1972,
Mhm.
and this is controversial, I think, because um, it it uh, it centralized all power in the hands of Park Chung Hee, right? And basically set aside constitutional law in Korea, created a new constitution. So, I mean, how important was this for the next steps in the military industrialization and the development of the HCI sector?
Yes. So this is one of the many controversial topics I think I cover
Well, whenever
in
you
my
talk about Park Chung Hee,
yes, and the
you're wading
Yushin.
into
Yes.
controversial terrain.
Yes.
Mhm.
So Yushin. So many wonder, if one of the ongoing debates was like Yushin necessary to enable the so-called HCI and also the defense industrialization because Yushin system was really set up this totalitarian, you could say a dictatorship, giving full present or full political, unlimited political power to Park Chung Hee. What Yushin did was basically to give the Blue House complete control over the national industries and the resources and the workforce. It gave Park Chung-hee also the constitutional right to mobilize basically the entire nation. And from Park Chung-hee's perspective, this total security system was necessary because South Korea was in a very dire security context. You have, but again, the threats coming from North Korea, and the U.S. is about to withdraw troops. What do? You have to develop your own defense capabilities. And to expedite, to do this by 1976, in 5 years' time, he needed the support of the nation. And this is one of his justification for setting up the Yushin system. Still very controversial to this day because many South Korean people did not enjoy, of course, they did not appreciate living under this Yushin era. However, the Yushin helped to set up the so-called presidential guidance system, which gave President Park a full authority, was specifically to his technocrats to control, micromanage, and to select the specific industries that will receive the concentrated economic resources from the state. And but through the Yushin, the state set up this structure where they could pick and choose which companies, which industries would receive all the national resources, and also gave them ability to nurture, to groom, to expand the skill workforce that could contribute to this militarized industrialization. They had to do it in a very quickly, very within a 5 year time frame. So this is how, in their mind, this is what justified the Yushin.
And it's pretty striking when you look at the timeline of Korea's early industrial development. So the Yushin Constitution was promulgated in 1972, and then POSCO's integrated Pohang steel mill was completed in 1973. The beginning and construction of the heavy machinery industrial complex in Changwon began in April 1974. And then Hyundai Heavy Industries constructed its Ulsan shipyard in June 1974. So I guess the planning went on, started before the Yushin Constitution came onto the scene, but it seemed like it accelerated everything. Am I drawing the right conclusion here?
Yes, I mean, what we have to understand is, you know, in 1970s, South Korea made tremendous progress. Of course, industrially, you have these installment of a massive industrial complexes also that supported these six heavy and chemical industries, and they started basically from the grounds up. And how was it the state able to push this at such a fast pace? I mean, it's because of the so-called the presidential guidance system. It was a very top-down military chain of command. It was very undemocratic, very exclusive, and there were costs to this type of method. Make no mistake. However, it did expedite the industrial transformation that was necessary, that set the foundation for the domestic defense capability, the domestic manufacturing of these advanced weapons. That was a state of art at the time. So, yes.
Okay. So we talked about a lot of amazing developments in building the industrial base and the military industrial base. So what's your assessment on, and a lot of these were financed through clandestine extra budgetary, a lot of the funding came from clandestine extra budgetary financing. So I think in any other system that would have been rife with corruption and inefficiency. But my impression from reading your book and other books about this era was that government spending was actually pretty efficient, like a lot more efficient than social welfare spending here in the U.S., to say the least. And Park, from what I've read, and I'm not a scholar of Korean history, he was never tainted with this perception of corruption, unlike his successors, because Chun Doo-won, who succeeded him after the assassination in 1979, and then No Tae-yu, they did go to jail, right? And I think one of the charges was that they misused national defense funds. From what you know from your study, would you say that the spending under the Park era was efficient and relatively low in corruption compared to what you just relatively low in absolute sense?
So
I don't mean to put you on the spot. I know this is really
I'm happy
controversial,
to
but
share
as a
my
scholar,
opinion.
you're
Yes. I do think it was very relatively efficient in allocating these defense budget to the most critical defense projects. I mean, Park Chung Hee set up a very elaborate surveillance system. It was a dual structure. There was a monitoring the so-called the five-member the committee that oversaw the defense spending. All the national defense tax, the money from the national defense donation were managed by this five-member committee and the Ministry of National Defense. However, Park Chung-hee did not completely trust the military for various reasons. So he set up his own five-member committee that actually oversaw the Yugo funding as well. Later, they expands to the 10-member committee and becomes even bigger. It was very micromanaged. And what I realized through these presidential documents related to the Yugo funding, then Park Chung-hee was heavily involved. He literally micromanaged every allocation of these money, the national defense donation money to the military projects needed his personal approval. It required his signature. And even the procurement, the weapon procurement deals with the foreign companies. Basically, every weapon-related policies needed Park Chung-hee's personal approval. And you can see in the original, the policy documents, Park Chung-hee's own signature. He had to approve in consultation with probably Oh Won-chul. So, and I do believe, according to my own research, he was very conscientious about how these national defense donation would be spent. And according to Oh Won-chul's memoir, And also, according to my interviews with the Park Chung Hee's policymakers like Kim Kwang-mo, Park Chung Hee was very adamant that this money from people's donations, he considered them um, sacred. Basically, they had to be used for the clean purposes to genuinely to support the self-reliant national defense. So he was very conscientious about how this money will be spent. And I think that this is one of the reasons why that we don't see any corruption by Park, at least in the usage of how the defense donations. And later on, as you mentioned, is the following subsequent administrations misuse some of these defense funds. But about Park Chung Hee, I do believe he was quite genuine about how this would be used, and this is why he set up such a strict system to manage these funds. I don't think the system was perfect. When I saw the documents, there were the presidential documents, there are reports of misusage of these funds by the local administrators, right? Local administrations, and there were the government had to really figure out how to make sure that all these resources by the people could be managed, properly channeled to the military projects without being misused. But relatively speaking, in a big picture, I think the system was quite efficient in making sure that the money was channeled to the proper the military projects under the Yugo.
Right. So South Korea's drive for self-reliant national defense, it did not end with the end of the Park government, the Park administration. It has continued on. Can you give us an update of where South Korea stands? I mean, we know Samsung's one of the biggest semiconductor producers in the world. POSCO, one of the big steel producers. So big in the steel industry, semiconductors, shipbuilding, a bunch of other industries. Where does Korea stand now, and what is its aspirations in terms of military development, military industrial development?
Yes. So South Korea made a remarkable, I think, progress since the 1970s in terms of its own defense production capabilities. Today, over 77% of weapon products, South Korea can locally produce them. So, which is a huge achievement. I mean, some of the key components of, like, for example, the jet fighters and some of the advanced weapons, like the surveillance equipment, it still depend on the U.S. technology. However, just within 50 years, South Korea is now the world's top 10 arms exporter, which is very, very remarkable when you consider how late it started to develop the domestic defense industry. So I think that really made a huge, that shows is an example of a huge progress that South Korea made. I think South Korea really used the blueprint that was initiated by Park Chung Hee, the Chaju Gukbang, self-reliant national defense, to continually propel this the technological industrial advancement. I mean, even today, South Korea puts a lot of emphasis on the Chaju, the self-reliance, the energy independence, security independence, technological, 기술 자립, right? The technological self-reliance, and this is why South Korea invests so much money in the R&D, the research and development, the technology, and the part of it, I think, it really has a lot to do with this 자주국방, the self-reliant national defense movement that began in the 1970s, and its effort to build an independent defense industry and to gain the technological autonomy to do so. And starting from the Park era, I think the subsequent administrations, whether conservative or liberal, they can differ on many different agendas. But when it comes to 자주 국방, self-reliant national defense and national security, I think we see some agreement. There's a lot of consensus, and this is why I think we see this emergence of a so-called the K-방산, the K-defense. We have a K-pop, K-fashion, K-beauty. Now we have a K-defense. And I think this has a lot to do with the legacy of Park Chung Hee's self-reliant national defense policy.
Yeah. You do mention in your book, you're quoting from the Stockholm Research Institute, that South Korea is the fastest growing among major arms exporters in the world. It was the 14th largest arm exporter in 2016. by 2021, the eighth largest. And President Yoon Suk-yeol has aspirations even to
Yes.
increase that, right? To put
Yes.
Korea on a higher notch.
The global pivotal state, quote unquote.
Right.
Yes, his current South Korea's defense plan, the Defense Innovation 4.0 plan, really it's I think essentially following the blueprint set by the Park Chung Hee to pursue this technological advancement, developing autonomous the technological capabilities to support South Korea's defense posture, independent defense posture. So this obsession, the South Korea's quest for the self-reliant national defense, I think really continues, whether the liberal or conservative. I mean, the conservative administrations, of course, put more emphasis on this alliance, of course, with the United States, whereas the liberal administrators, they also they're a little more they deviate from that. However, at the core, they do pursue a more independent defense industry posture, and this is why in the previous Moon Jae-in administration, a huge investment in the defense industry, and also going back to the Nomuyon, the Park Geun-hye administration, we see, and Lee Myung-bak too, there's a commitment to the national security that is not compromised. So I think this and also the simultaneous parallel development of a security and economy. That is the blueprint I think was really initiated by the Park Chung Hee, and that is the one I think faithfully that the future administrations have followed.
Right. So maybe we can just wrap up with that. So every Korean administration, whether progressive or conservative, is committed to this self-reliant national defense. I know during the Moon Jae-in administration, defense expenditure grew at a faster pace than overall budget expenditure. So what is this still being supported by the citizens? I mean, is there still this all in for the nation support, or is there more opposition to than there was under Park Chung Hee to this self-reliant military industrialization?
Yes, I'm glad you raised that question. I think that the self-reliant national defense policy, broadly, is supported by the South Korean citizens. Surprisingly, many people say that is under Park Chung Hee. There was of course like not much. The democracy was a compromise, that people were coerced, pressure, forced to contribute to the state. However, majority of when I surveyed around 400 people for this book, I asked about their opinion about the Park Chung Hee, and many people who lived through the Park Chung Hee era are actually the ones who support the Park Chung Hee the most to this day, whereas the younger generation, I think, are a little more ambivalent or oppositional to Park Chung Hee's legacy. However, whenever there's a national crisis, when we saw, for example, when the COVID broke out, you see the entire nation coming together, volunteering, people contributing to the state efforts to regulate the COVID, passing out the mask, passing out the monitor, and to make sure that people can check themselves. Whenever there's a national disaster or the provocation by North Korea, I think we see a very similar pattern recurring, where people, maybe due to the historical, the collective memory, or through the embedded now the culture, people coming together, the responding and self-mobilizing basically. And where did that come from? I think a lot of it has to do with the Park Chung Hee's legacy. And I just want to add also, the book, it is about, of course, Park Chung Hee is a very pivotal figure. I want to make it also, however, clear that it's also about the achievement by the South Korean people. This is why I interviewed the South Korean, the engineers, the scientists, workforces. I interviewed 313 Korean civilians, surveyed them, who contribute to the national defense donation. And it was a state-led project, make no mistake. However, I think this is a collective achievement of the South Korean people, how South Korea was able to so quickly develop the defense industry and to achieve this so-called economic miracle at the same time. I think that narrative does not just belong to Park Chung Hee. It really belongs to South Korean people. And that is one of the messages, I think, in my book that I would like to highlight.
That certainly is a powerful message. Chelsea, I think we're ready for questions. How should we do this? Let's get the audience questions first, and then I have some questions printed here where they've emailed in, but we'll do audience questions first. Anyone in the audience have a question?
I guess
Keep your questions question-like, and please identify yourself.
my name is Ethan Lee. I'm with Foreign Affairs, and I guess I'm curious. And you touched on this during the talk, but thinking about the history between the U.S., threatening to pull out during different administrations, and South Korea almost going nuclear. I guess what continuities and differences do you see between now? How is today different, or the kind of possible return of a Trump 2.0 administration, would that be different? And in terms of a related question to that is with why South Korea almost got the bomb, was that from your research, do you think that's mainly attributable to security reasons, or are there also, is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, how South Korea would react in today's context? South Korea has come very far. It has a very potent defense capability on its own. So I think now with that, I think South Korea, you can use it as a sort of a diplomatic card to negotiate if U.S. I mean, the conservative administrations still want U.S. to stay. And fundamentally, they want to stick to that traditional alliance structure, whereas the more progressive administrations want a more autonomous South Korean military and transfer the operation control back to the South Korea. So there are some divisions about this topic. However, South Korea now having a very strong weapon defense capabilities. I think this gives them huge leverage, actually, diplomatically. And this actually can relate to your second question about whether the nuclear arms, was it just for the weapon purposes, or was there more? I think Park Chung Hee used it as a political card, basically, to make sure. Actually, South Korea was at least 10 years away from developing its own nuclear arms, according to the declassified CIA documents. However, by pursuing the nuclear arms and to showing the United States that it would do whatever it takes to realize its purpose, becoming a nuclear power, this was very threatening to United States policymakers, because it does not want arms race in East Asia. Then the Japan, at the time, the North Korea, other countries, they want to limit the nuclear proliferation. So it was very important. For Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, at the time, the South Korea going nuclear was more threatening than any threats coming from North Korea. Okay, so Park Chung Hee knew this, and this is why he used the nuclear missile as a leverage to gain concessions, various concessions from the United States. And for United States, it conceded, and then it started to it gave actually more weapon technology to South Korea for giving up their nuclear arms, the program in 1976. So, and one of the reasons the U.S. did this was because by giving more aid to South Korea, it could engage with South Korea and make sure they could manage, they could control, be involved in their weapon program. So this is how, going back to your earlier questions, U.S. Partly gave concession to control Park Chung Hee. For Park Chung Hee, he used the nuclear missile program to receive more military weapons aid from the United States. Does that answer your question?
What was the Combined Forces Command set up as part of this
Yes.
concession to South Korea to get
Absolutely.
them more involved? Yeah.
Yes. After Park Chung Hee's he set up a new nuclear agency in 1976 that basically restarted the nuclear arms program, and later after the 1978 when it successfully test launched the Polar Bear 2, this is when U.S. decides, okay, we need to give more autonomy to the South Koreans, not just try to control, but to monitor them, but not completely ban their development, because this would actually inspire them to develop more weapons.
Right. By the way, where was South Korea getting the material for the bomb, the enriched uranium or enriched plutonium?
Yes. So there was an agency called KAERI, that KAEIRI, that actually worked in very closely with the ADD. They collected the technologies from various places. Actually, from early 1970s, the U.S. document shows that South Korea was sending out these expeditions of scientists, engineers, military officials to various countries to gather the nuclear processing, the technologies, and for the missile, the carrier of these nuclear warheads, it was also trying to gather various technologies from everywhere. And mostly France actually is the one that gave some major technological aid, because France would not follow the U.S. order to give, do not give the nuclear technology to South Korea. Later, the U.S. Strongly intervened and stopped it. But nonetheless, South Korea continued just pursuing the technologies from everywhere around the world, which I actually detail more in my book. But France was a major contributor of these nuclear processing technology, also the missile propulsion technology that the U.S. would not give. So later, South Korea would combine the technologies from United States, some that U.S. did give away in 1975 from the Lockheed Martin Corporation. It gave a limited technological aid to South Korea for missile propulsion, and combined it with the French technology and the indigenous technology and other places, and this is how they were able to develop this hybrid missile program, the PECOM, the polar bear.
Sorry, another follow-up question. Did North Korea get wind of South Korea's nuclear aspirations and weapons development program? Was South Korea first, or was North Korea first in wanting to develop?
Yeah, I mean,
nuclear bombs?
the declassified Russian documents show that from the 1960s, actually, North Korea actually was also trying to develop the nuclear arms. The Moscow was, of course, trying to control that, afraid that it would trigger arms race. They knew each other, I think, very well, what was going on internally. There are not many records of the North Korea's in the arms manufacturing at the time. However, North Korea was very vigilant about what was going on in the South Korean weapons program. Actually, they had spies everywhere in the defense corporations. When I read the interview, these defense corporation, the engineers and the scientists, there were North Korean spies, and many of them actually from the Japan's or North Korean community, the Chochongyong community. They came into South Korea. They worked for major defense companies like Hanwha, and then the government would find out and put them into jail. So there were spies everywhere. So they knew each other, what was going on. However, I think the start of these defense industry development in South Korea in the 1970s really kept North Korea on their toes, because with the heavy and chemical industries, North Korea planted virtually spies, and especially in these key companies that developed the weapons. So I think they were from early on, they were aware of what was going on.
Right. We have a question over here.
Thanks. My name is Vincent O'Connor, and I'm a retired attorney here in New York State. I was a narcotics prosecutor for about 6 years, and I was a New York State administrative law judge for over 20 years. I have my undergraduate degree from Columbia University, where I majored in history. And shortly after I graduated, Charles Armstrong joined the faculty. He recently retired a few years ago. He has a very interesting book called The Tyranny of the Weak.
Yes.
And that book, and he has another book also, they deal with North Korea. That was his specialization. And in The Tyranny of the Weak, he has something that Mr. Byrne, I think, was going toward. He said that the imposition of communism in North Korea is not the communization of Korean culture and society, because the North Koreans, I think his point is, he's actually part Korean, actually, is so strong culturally that it's the Koreanization of communism, and that's what people need to understand. So that's A, and then B. B, you know, I'm old enough really to remember the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, we were told all these terrible things that were going to happen to us if South Vietnam falls. And the interesting thing about the Vietnam War is it's not a counterfactual. We don't have to sit here and say, well, what if South Vietnam had fallen because it fell? They lost. They totally lost. And all the dire predictions that we were told, they were going to be in Hawaii, San Francisco Bay was going to be the way they would land, just Topeka, Kansas is going to fall eventually. It was all wrong. It was all wrong. So when we couple those two, the strength of North Korea as Koreans and the dire predictions we heard about Vietnam, which cost us 60,000 of guys about my age, and it was all wrong. So is the takeaway from that that maybe America should stop trying to contain North Korea and villainize North Korea, because you're not going to win it anyway, and they're probably going to accomplish what they want, notwithstanding all the villainization. And maybe we should begin some type of a strategy that's more, I don't want to say accommodation, but just deals with the reality that these guys are really talented, and we seem to be losing from the Pueblo incident to the RC-135 shoot down. We're just losing slowly, but I think they call it the salami something, where you're losing piece by piece. And that seems to be America vis-a-vis North Korea and the containment policy, which just seems so wrong.
I ask you to keep your
questions. Do you have any suggestion about how America should treat
I think you're
North
a little
Korea
off
now?
topic for the military industrialization. It's almost, I mean, it's certainly fascinating. We could talk about it later, but I don't know how this fits in.
So, I mean, I do think you brought a thank you very much, by the way. It's very thoughtful. I think it was a very important and intriguing question. I do think, but I guess to make it concise, South Korea did try to accommodate North Korea in the past under the so-called the Sunshine Policy. And also, I think different U.S. administrations also have tried to please or accommodate North Korea. I think there's a lot I want to say here, but in the interest saving time, North Korea, since the founding of the North Korean state, if you look at starting with the origin of the Juche ideology, you look at the long-term pattern, I don't think it has not remained completely static, but the patterns have repeated itself, I think. And there's a lot of meaning, I think, when I put into the statement. But you look at how it has essentially it has not changed that much, and no matter what we do, that is my point. The regime has, from the three family, the successors you go from the Kim Il Sung to Kim Jong Un, the Kim Jong Il to Kim Jong Un. Fundamentally, the nature of the regime has not really shifted that much. There's certain things that it emphasizes, starting from the very founding of a North Korean state. So that is there's a lot more I can add, but maybe we can have this conversation after. But thank you very much for that question.
Yeah, it's like another topic. It's fascinating. But so I still think that South Korea's the military-industrial complex, the primary motivation and purpose is for defense against North Korea, right? Not to make a lot of money exporting around the world these arms. That's a beneficial byproduct. Do we have another question? And then I have one audience question, one phoned-in question I can talk about. So, okay, go ahead. But a question, right?
Yeah, my name is Michael. So a lot can be learned from comparisons. And, when I saw the topic of this talk, which I know a little bit about the subject too, but I also know a little about the subject also in Taiwan, which is actually very similar to the situation in South Korea with Chiang Kai-shek, strong authoritarian.
Yes.
His policy also had this military first industrial policy to support. Actually, he wanted to support an reinvasion of China with his military base. But so I mean, so he even nuclear weapons, a covert nuclear weapons program also. Many parallels to South Korea at a very similar time also. So my main is if you have any comparison to make with the Taiwan example, or do you actually know anything about the Taiwan example to compare to this? And maybe even also the South Africa example from the late 70s, early 80s, because of the embargo, they had developed an independent military industry also, which became a very, before the collapse of the South African economy, which became a very strong exporter of arms also in South Africa.
Yeah, that's a very very interesting question. So I do talk about the Japan, Taiwan in my book's discussion. So Taiwan, you're right. Contextually, I think context-wise, South Korea and Taiwan share many similarities. I think one thing, however, really sets South Korea apart from the Taiwanese case was that South Korea faced, in the context of a U.S. plan to completely withdraw troops from South Korea out of blue, and then the provocations that is constantly coming from North Korea very closely, hundreds of incidents every year, especially escalating from the late 1960s. It was in a situation where it really had to expedite the defense industry development. And also there was a reduction of a U.S. military aid starting from 1960. And then the Nixon promised a new 5-year military modernization plan. But starting from the following year, from 1972, according to the documents, you see the military aid decreasing because the U.S. is also running out of budget due to its involvement in the Vietnam War, their political position to fund the South Korea as well. So in South Korea's case, it had to rely on the various existing structure like the chaebol, the big corporations, and there's a much dire need, I think, to really accelerate this defense development. In Taiwan's case, it primarily relied on the small and medium enterprises. There was not much emphasis on developing an indigenous defense industry in the 1970s. So I think it's a little bit different context, even though you can share a lot of similarities. So I don't know if that completely answers it, but in my book, I do talk about some of those similarities in the Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. They're popularly framed as so-called the East Asian, the developmental states, and what really differentiated South Korea from these other models of development.
Well, I think we're like beyond overtime. We're in double overtime. I'll just, there's one more question that was emailed in. I'll just ask that. So this is Jeffrey Close from some organization called Military Auto Source. So his question is, please discuss how the ideas of imperial Japanese reform bureaucrats and their vision of creating a managerial state influenced the political and economic thinking of Park Chung Hee.
Yes. So this is a very good historical question. I think, so my PhD advisor, Professor Carter Ecker, actually wrote a book about actually this very topic, how the Park Chung Hee's formative years as a colonized soldier in the Japan-occupied Manchuria was very critical to his guiding philosophy that he used for developing the South Korea's economy and to guide the South Korea's modernization. That actually is very important also for my research, because the Park Chung Hee's, I think, exposure to the Japanese army-led Manchurian economy was very critical to his later, the military style and the technocratic development as well, because that's actually the method that Japan used also in the 1930s. I mean, if you look at also the heavy and chemical industrialization, it's really modeled after the Japanese, the managerial state in the 1930s. I mean, you look at the technocratic development, even the MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and in the industry, Park Chung Hee set up the Economic Planning Board, modeled after the MITI. So and also the reliance in this centralized the state policy making to drive to engineer the economic development in the hands of a few elite technocrats. I think all these model after the Japanese technocratic governance actually that really began from like the 1930s. When I interviewed the Park Chung Hee's technocrats, they say that the Japan really served as a paramount model for engineering to develop the HCI policymaking as well. So the influence is, and also the Park Chung Hee's leadership style, the very militaristic style, that is a reflection of, I think, this martial template that Park Chung Hee adopted from the Japanese military during his days as a colonized soldier. So to make an answer short.
Okay. Well, I hope you all found this as fascinating as I have, and I highly recommend you reading Professor Kwon's book, Cornerstone of the Nation. It's exceptionally well written. It's free of political science jargon, and it's very accessible. I think no matter what your knowledge level is on this issue. So thank you for coming to the Korea Society, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And I do hope we'd like to continue programs like this. So I do hope you will consider membership in the Korea Society. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I forgot to mention, thank you, Chelsea, for all your work on putting this together,
Yes.
and also Bradley and Peter. So I think Peter's here, right?
Great.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.